Marine Mammal Observers. Welcome to the Marine Mammal Observer Association webinar, which we hope is the first in a series of webinars on issues we feel are relevant to the community of people involved in mitigation for marine fauna. The MMOA is a professional organization and committed to raising the standards of mitigation through the development of MMOs and the evolution of mitigation. We are a non-profit organization, and I invite you to examine our mission and position statements on our website when you have time. As part of our remit, we are committed to the better collection and use of data, and this brings us nicely into the topic of today's speaker, Dr. Brandon Southall. Brandon has been involved in many research efforts on the topic of sound in the marine environment. He was the lead author in the milestone papers in 2007 and 2019 on the effects of noise on hearing in marine mammals, which everyone involved in environmental management offshore is familiar with. In 2021, Brandon was the lead author on the paper Marine Mammal Noise Exposure Criteria, Assessing the Severity on Marine Mammal Behavior Responses to Human Noise. So I have the great pleasure of welcoming Dr. Southall here today to give further information on the topic of behavioral responses in studies. Again, just to remind you to submit all questions via the chat function and to be aware that this webinar is being recorded. Thank you. Brandon, are you there?
Yeah, sure am. Thank you so much, Patrick. I really appreciate the opportunity to be here, to get to talk with and hear from and learn from those of you that spend so much time on the water around marine mammals and working in mitigation context to protect them. I really am going to try and limit the presentation part of this to half of our time, if I possibly can, just because I think as much of the discussion and questions that you have of me, and probably that I have of some of you, may be the most fruitful part of it. But I'll go through and tell you a little bit about some of the things that I've worked on in this space. I will kind of focus on things from this 2021 paper, but also I think what's sort of come from it, and what my career has. You can see from my affiliations here, I have a small company. I work through and I'm formally affiliated with 2 universities that I work actively at. The Marine Labs here in Santa Cruz, and also with the folks at Duke. Marine Lab, Doug Novacek is a close colleague of mine. I'm hoping that he may be able to join us for the second half of this discussion. He was a co-author on the noise criteria, and I also work through a new nonprofit that has education and conservation programs here in California. So I've sort of spanned, right? So I got private sector, academia, nonprofit here, and I worked for the U.S. federal government for 6 years on the science policy interface, and really it was there that the first noise criteria paper in 2007 that Patrick mentioned was published. Was when I was with the government, and some of the entire motivation for that, which actually started before I came to NOAA, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, was motivated to try and give the agency, that federal agency, and that manages noise impacts for the U.S. federal government, more structure, more insight, more criteria for how they manage ocean noise issues. And there's a long history of how they got to that point. But I guess from my perspective, the experience there kind of gave me insight into that process, the rule setting process, the rule mitigation development process, and how science informs criteria and is only one component of how those types of regulatory decisions are made. But I am really happy to be speaking with a group of professionals that spend more time on the water around these animals than many, if not most, scientists do. So I'm really interested to hear some of your insights into how some of these things which are in a paper, can play out on the water. And one of the things that Doug Novacek and I have been really, kind of advocating for is more incorporation of observations made in the course of requisite mitigation activities into building our knowledge and increasing our sample sizes for things that have historically been done, in experimental and scientific context. But there's a lot of information obviously being collected about behavior and behavioral responses of animals through mitigation. So we've kind of been pushing for more incorporation and integration of activities and observation during activities that are required for mitigation in science. So that's some of the things that I'm looking forward to talking about. So I'll get moving so I can hit my target half hour here. My good friend Megan McKenna wrote an article about acoustic ecology and physics today a couple years ago that I would really encourage people to take a look at, because I think it's a really good technical but accessible depiction of what we consider the field of acoustic ecology. And I think a lot of the work that I've done is tried to kind of look at different aspects of what we call the acoustic ecology of animals, which includes things like what are the onboard systems that they have to perceive sound in the environment, how are they using sound in natural contexts to live, what are the kind of consequences of and impacts. And a lot of the studies have sort of jumped to this point and don't always have this foundation of the sort of baseline functions of sound, and how animals are exposed to sound in their natural environment. And then the environment itself plays a key role in sort of shaping what a sound will look like once it actually gets to an animal. And that's a really important thing. The same sound in a very shallow water, muddy bottom environment is going to be very different than open ocean and highly reflective kind of bathymetry. Polar environments are very different than equatorial in environments in terms of just how sound behaves. So I like to start here because I think it's important to realize that you have these things that are already present in the environment. You have the animals that have different hardware themselves to receive sound. They have different functions of how they use it, and those things can have different consequences based on all of those things. And we often just sort of jump into like, what's the effect of sound? But you have to keep these environmental and acoustic ecological perspectives in mind when considering this. So probably not a surprise to any of you that are very familiar with marine mammals that sound's very important for them. The physics of the environment really favors the use of sound over other forms of reception and communication. That's not to say that marine mammals can't see or smell or feel. It's just that sound is preferentially effective at communicating information over further distances underwater. And accordingly, most of all marine animals, not just marine mammals, but I have fish on there too, invertebrates make and receive sound. And they are critically important for all of the vital things that marine mammals do. Reproducing, foraging, that's true, especially for the odontocetes with specialized echolocation, but other animals passively listen and use that information in foraging, detecting predators, finding their way around, again, both actively and passively. And so, these animals have been doing this for tens of millions of years, hundreds of millions of years in the case of fish. And people sort of figured out the same physics once we started trying to find our way around in the ocean. And we use sound either on purpose with things like sonar systems or seismic surveys to image the environment and learn more about it, communication systems, or just as a consequence of driving ships around or building things, we make sound sort of intentionally or incidentally. And the key questions are kind of, where there's an overlap between people and marine mammals in the acoustic space. The key questions, and these are kind of things that have guided my career, is, how can we, including by listening to the environment, how can we better understand where animals are and what they're doing? What are the negative impacts of noise on marine animals, again, within that context of acoustic ecology? And then one of the really key and practical questions, which is where a lot of you come in, is, how can we make these observations, knowing what we know about potential impacts, to try and reduce the impacts of activities that many of which are vital to economic and national security issues. So that's where I think in the constructive space, it's not just identifying effects, but what can we do about them in an informed way. Okay, so there's a whole spectrum of things, obviously, that can happen from the introduction of sound into the marine space. I've sort of ordered these from increasingly bad but decreasingly likely. Probably the most common thing is it's just present in the environment, and there's not a discernible or specific negative impact. We kind of get into some of the auditory issues. I've circled behavioral responses because that's what I'm going to focus mainly on today. And within those behavioral responses, we have a spectrum from I know it's there up to I'm leaving the area and I'm not coming back, and a whole bunch of things that are probably more common than that in between. I'm not going to talk about physiology, but it's certainly a topic of consideration from some of the work with decompression sickness up through studies of increased cortisol as a function of sound exposure and implications for immune function and other things. And then, strandings are really what drove the issue to the front page of newspapers, to the Supreme Court, to the formation of that panel that led to the 2007 criteria. Was largely motivated, if you dial it back several years, to the Bahamas stranding of beaked whales that happened in 2000, and the need to get more serious about how we understand and evaluate those things. Those events are obviously bad for the individuals involved. They can be bad for local populations, as was documented in the Bahamas. They're probably quite uncommon, but can be locally important. They've just sort of dominated a lot of the early awareness and study of this issue. But as we've gotten further into it, we've realized that these things, like behavioral responses that may be sublethal, can still be important, because you're influencing feeding behavior, habitat utilization, predation risk, things that can be important to animals. So I've circled behavioral responses there because I'm going to focus almost exclusively on that going forward. So I thought maybe it was helpful to realize, I think, some progression, in terms of the thinking about how we assess noise. In the early days, which isn't completely gone yet, but is sort of quickly, I think, fading away, we had these step functions. And by that, I mean a single threshold of noise where you said below this point, there's no probability of behavioral or auditory effects. And above this single received level, there's 100% chance. And, we all know that the world doesn't really function in that way, but these kind of, speed limits of noise level was how some of the early thinking came into place. And it was really, that was the framework within the US regulatory structure, where 160 decibels was, irrespective of frequency, time, all those things, was the behavioral threshold, and 180 decibels was the the threshold for injury. And that was kind of where we came from in establishing and trying to improve some of these noise criteria. We've moved a lot more into probabilistic functions, which is more how nature works with probabilities and risk functions. And increasingly, we're seeing some kind of progress on analytical paradigms and frameworks that are built on energetics and population models that incorporate aspects of risk assessment and bring in other factors like what the context is, how the species is doing, what other kinds of stressors are present in the environment. And I think there's been a lot of new progress there. And I'll kind of end with some things that I think are fruitful ways forward in regard to moving past these kind of simple step function thresholds. I'm just going to talk for 1 minute about this paper, which is now 15 years ago, which seems a little crazy to me. And a lot of what was in it was hearing, and it was a key development, albeit obvious one, that a whale hears differently than porpoises do. People had documented that. Well, not necessarily with direct measurements of hearing in whales, but we know that dolphins and seals and porpoises of different species hear quite differently from one another, just like you can't hear a dog whistle, but your dog can. So it's just splitting the animals into what we called functional hearing groups, and these M-weighting filters that are on the left there basically kind of are a picture of overall, on average, where animals hear well and where they hear poorly. And so that was a major step forward. We kind of made this distinction between pulses and non-pulses. And then we came up with these TTS, temporary threshold shift, or permanent threshold shift onsets. And we incorporated multiple metrics and importantly, things that account for how long a sound is. If you've got a disturbance that's a second versus a week, that's a very different thing. And so the metrics need to capture that. That's pretty much all I'm going to say about hearing. One of the things that came out of that paper as well, there's not a bullet on here that says behavioral response thresholds. And that was deliberate, not because people didn't want them, but because they don't exist. They're not single function thresholds. You get things that are more probabilistic and that spanning different species, will also differ based on what kind of response you're looking at. And so we developed this scale that tries to match that gradation of severity that occurs within behavior, and then a process of how to apply that in deriving kind of exposure response probability functions. And the severity scale it's a 10-step scale, and we applied it to several different groups of species and took data from different studies and accounted for the fact that some animals are counted several times, and you've got groups of animals. That's why there's fractions of individuals. But you see that there's not a point where you get no response and then you get 100% response. And in fact, it's a little bit more complicated than that. But if we look at that scale, and I'm just focusing on the mid part of it, and I'm going to show you a parallel portion of what we would call kind of moderate severity. So we took the 0 through 3s and put them into kind of mild severity, and the 7, 8, 9s that have stranding at the end of it and permanent habitat abandonment. Many of the changes that we would kind of expect to see would fall within this kind of moderate severity response. And these are probably the ones that are most important for us to consider in the context of mitigation. You can't necessarily mitigate for everything, or would you want to mitigate for every single type of behavioral response you could get? And you would probably always want to mitigate against things that involved injury or mortality. But it's things like these kinds of changes in group distribution, shifts in vocal patterns, display behaviors that might indicate aggression, changes, the onset of changes in reproductive behavior, display behavior. Those are the kind of things that we saw. And one of the things you notice here is there are these parallel scores for field observations and laboratory studies. And there were some sort of unintended equivalences that people made between these two from the 2007 scale. And when I get to 21, I'll show you that we just sort of split these things out and said, this is the process for lab animals. And, the context is so different for free ranging animals that they should really be separate. But I guess one other thing to note here is there's a number of words in here that are a little waffly, right? Like brief or minor, sustained, prolonged, and there's some definitions, right? Duration longer than the duration of operation, but there was some wording in here that left a lot to the interpretation and the application. And people, including some studies that I've done, tried to take these severity scores and equate them to actual observations of animals and say, this is a severity of 5 at 140 dB, and make those kind of assessments. But there's definitely some interpretation that goes along with this, and processes that people used with groups of scorers and two independent groups and an adjudicator, and those kind of things were done. But there's some waffle words in here that we tried to be a little more specific on when we kind of came back to this. So as Patrick mentioned, we published the hearing data separate. So when we reconvened the panel, like a decade went by, and people said, hey, there's been enough progress, there's been enough new literature that we're ready to kind of update these. The process, Jim Finneran works with the Navy Marine Mammal Program, and the Navy had continued to update from the 2007 criteria during that intervening decade. And Jim developed some processes with other people from the Navy, but Jim was really centrally involved in that. And we picked that up largely, made a few modifications of it on the hearing side, and published the revised noise exposure criteria in 2019. And I'm not going to focus on it, but the reference is there. A separate sort of subset of the panel that included people like Lars Beider and Valeria Senegaglia that work on whale watching science and observations, and incorporated some of the extensive literature of observations of impacts from whale watching were kind of brought into the revised behavioral paper that we put out in 2021. There was actually a third paper that was more of a kind of higher level overview of both of those, and some other topics that came out in Acoustics Today in 2021 as well. So there was one paper from the panel in 2007. There were 3 papers that came out in 19 through 21, and I'm going to focus on the behavioral one. So I'm going to talk through several components of it, and then try to finish with our intent to apply some of these things and put it in the context of risk assessment. One of the things we did in that paper was, and I know some of this is small, but it was intended to sort of say, in an ideal world, this would be all of the kind of information that we would want to have about a noise exposure event. There's probably no single study where we have every one of these kinds of factors reported, but we're trying to push the field, including ourselves, to be more systematic and detailed in the kinds of information that we report about the animals that are exposed. And this would include a number of the things that many of you all on the call would be observing in the field. What is there? What is the age class? What are are the calves present? What is the behavioral state of the animals during some activity? And then a whole host of things about the context and things like spatial orientation and movement relative to animals, how rare or not the exposure is in that area. Are there predator species that may be present? Is there similarity between the sounds themselves and the signals of predators? And then a whole host of things related to the metrics, not just the single RMS sound level, which is what we've gotten a lot, but SEL is sound exposure level, which incorporates the duration. What is that over a single duration, over repeated durations? What's the noise in the environment? How does that relate to the hearing sensitivity of the animals? So again, we're not likely to get all of these things from every study or even from any study, but we're just pushing the field to try and be more systematic in how these kinds of things are reported. I'm not going to even talk about the captive settings other than to say this is it's a 5-step or a 6-step process, other than to say we took the captive responses and dealt with them completely separately. And we actually split the captive responses into things that were related to just animals living in places and that weren't related to trained responses versus things that animals are actually reinforced for doing, which are pretty different kinds of changes. And I'm just going to kind of leave that because I know we're focused on, and you all spend your time largely working with animals in the field or entirely. I'm not going to go through all of these. I'm just going to kind of highlight. So this is a comparable portion of that moderate severity range in the middle of the function. And a couple key things to notice from what we did was following the kind of vital rates development of the population consequences models that have kind of segregated behaviors that are related to survival, feeding, and reproduction as having kind of different implications and different kinds of observations. Not that there aren't, and you'll see if you look across, there's actually some of these observations that relate to each of those tracks. But the intent was to try to start to segregate behavior into not just, was there a change and this is what we observed, but there was a change that related to foraging success and that was defined based on specific time parameters. So during the exposure extending beyond the exposure period, things that relate to energy expenditure. So trying to incorporate things that have a particular biological meaning and that have additional quantitative ways of calculating them over particular durations. So I'm not going to go through this in much more detail than that. This is, like I said, these are 3 of 10 criteria in there. The table's bigger, but it's also intended to be a little bit more structured and intended to be able to inform the assessment of particular behaviors related to survival, reproduction, and feeding. Then if you go through the paper, you can see that we didn't actually try to assess every behavioral response paper ever published. We looked at 300 or 400 of them. We kind of ranked those that had the most of the kind of information that we thought we needed to be able to do this. And then we took 5 examples from sonar, from seismic surveys, from construction, from vessel operations, and we kind of boiled. We took those examples. We scored them using the new severity scale. We broke them into individuals where possible, and there's some tables like this. This is just an example of one of them that gets you to the point where you have a species, a group, or a discernible known individual. We deal with the fact that sometimes animals are exposed multiple times. So that's where you get that individual weighting, a score associated with each one, and a receive level where possible and where reported. And almost all of the papers report RMS and not sound exposure level, but you start to get that in some of the newer papers. So that was kind of our retrospective assessment or application of the criteria going backwards. And I'm gonna kind of steer us to the discussion here with a brief synthesis of some experimental work we've done and how we tried to apply it. There's a long story about the sonar behavioral response work that we did with the Navy in Southern California, but we kind of were able to do enough that we built up big enough sample sizes to publish a number of papers, and we started to sort of focus our attention on variables, contextual variables, like what are the animals are doing, what's the prey environment, what are the spatial relationships, and looking at these responses of avoidance and then changes in things like feeding that relate to some of the kind of severity assessments that I mentioned. And we looked at beaked whales, but which not surprisingly are more sensitive to sonar. That's not a surprise to anyone. We just sort of documented some of the nature of those. But looking at some of these other species that haven't been a part of strandings, like blue whales, we were able to kind of get some insight into the nature of response and the dependence of those responses on things related to what we call the context. This is a large table of all the animals that we exposed to different kinds of sonar. Blue whales, 42 blue whales that were exposed in different to similar sounds, but in different contexts. So we're looking at animals that either were exposed or not exposed to two different types of sound. MFAS is mid-frequency sonar, PRN is pseudo-random noise. But looking at animals that were either not feeding or that were feeding near the surface or that were feeding deep in different contexts. And we used both statistical methods and then this expert scoring as an application of the severity scale. We actually got pretty comparable results between those types of tools, both of which have pros and cons. But they led us, these kinds of measurements led us to some really interesting observations. So one of them is that we see, and the details of the analysis I won't go into, but where you see these differences in the during or not is kind of interesting. So we see large differences in the exposure during mid-frequency active sonar for deep feeding animals, but not non-feeding or surface feeding animals, which was a pretty interesting finding. You have the same species, you have the same levels of noise, but a lack of response in one context. We also found, and this was a paper that Ari Friedlander did, if you don't take into account the distribution of prey in feeding animals, you might be missing it. And the bottom line for the panels on the bottom is, if we just looked at the response before and after in terms of diving behavior, we would have actually concluded that there was no effect of either of the two types of exposures, but they were significantly different in the controls. It turns out that the distribution of prey patches between the exposures differed sufficiently that the prey environment itself explains some of these changes, and incorporating the behavioral response with the distribution of prey, we could show and see these significant changes as a function of sound exposure and not during controls. So it tells us that what the animals are doing and what the environment is doing is an important consideration. And then probably one of the main takeaways from that was important, I think, is these animals look like they're doing what we would call ranging. So same SEL sound exposure, so the same received energy of noise across the x-axis, and the probability of response for different severities. So maybe if you just look at that 4 to 6 on the top, those are the kind of responses I was talking about. For animals that receive the same level of sound at 1 kilometer versus 5 kilometers, just based on how it behaves in the environment, you see this much lower probability of response. And that tells us the animals are saying it's not just how loud it is that is affecting whether I respond, but if it's something that's close to me, I'm going to be more likely to respond at the same level. And so these behavioral state issues, these environmental issues related to prey, these spatial issues related to proximity can be important. It's not that the received level of sound isn't important. It's just not the whole story. And so further to that sort of move away from these single function thresholds. Okay, last thing, and I really do want to leave us with time to discuss, there was a recent paper that Enrico Perrotta led where we brought these data, the blue whale data that I just showed you, together with some of the environmental data and put these things into an energetic framework in the context of populations. And basically this was like the behavioral response field meets the population consequences of disturbance field, and in a really positive way. And we tried to so here you see some multi-step kinds of thresholds, and there's some sort of, unique things that we did in developing these. Sometimes it's hard to define the upper and lower limits of functions where you don't have behavioral response that goes all the way up to the top. So we took that observation that near and far exposures would have very different probabilities. We use the actual data from those scenarios where animals were near or far, and they represent some of these probabilistic breakpoints. But then we took things at the bottom end about the noise in the environment, or at the top end about hearing and the effects of noise on hearing, like TTS is 99% of the function here. What we call effective quiet or equivalent quiet is the 90% point unless you have behavioral response there. And so we're developing these things with increasing information about the environment, about the sensory systems, and about behavior. And then we incorporated some of the baseline behavior from weeks-long periods to look at foraging and energetics. There's also some sort of different distributions of krill that have different energetic implications, and then these kind of probabilistic functions based on receive level that incorporate some of these other factors, like range. Okay, so I've got one sort of last placeholder here that I'm going to kind of leave mostly as something to come back to. I've been working with a number of folks to try and incorporate risk assessment methods that are based on a spatial, temporal, spectral layered model that gives us a relativistic, what we call an exposure index of the severity of exposure that makes up one axis of a risk matrix, and some metrics of vulnerability that include population size, habitat utilization, things related to masking, the presence of other stressors. That's a structured relativistic framework to kind of guide what we think the severity of response is for certain kinds of scenarios. And that's kind of all I want to say about that, but I might come back for it depending on how we make in the discussion. And just to wrap here, I think our overall perspective is realizing that we started focusing on noise issues based on these kinds of strandings and lethal things. And we're realizing there's a lot of sublethal and subinjurious kinds of responses that can be important that we need to understand. It's important, I didn't really get into this in a whole lot of detail, but we've moved from like simulations of things to actual full-scale operations. And I think that's where some of the measurements of things during the operation of real full-scale activities in a structured way can be really important, and we've started to do that experimentally. You see some of the durations going from early studies that looked at instantaneous observations to what do those things mean in the context of a month of behavior for this animal, behavioral response studies looking on longer term scales. I didn't really talk about physiology, but we're incorporating stress hormone kind of measurements into behavioral response studies, fitting in some of these energetic models. And then these kind of relativistic risk assessments, I think, are hopefully gonna help guide some of the decision making and complement some of the more complicated energetic calculations of population consequences that sometimes don't have all the data you want to have in them. So. Okay, I think I didn't quite hit my mark. I think I had 38 minutes there. So, but I think that leaves us a good time for questions. So I'm going to stop there and see. I don't see the chat, but I see there's a bunch of things in there. So if you guys want to pull out, maybe we can talk about things. I'll stop there.
That was great. Thank you, Brandon. That was a lot to digest in a short period of time, but
Yeah.
it's always the way. Go ahead, Ash. Were you gonna say something?
No, I was just going to say, yeah, brilliant talk. We've got a few questions come up, so I think Ashley's gonna fire away.
We do. We have one from Lindy, and they ask, what about responses that are not visible from the surface, such as stress, which can only be detected via cortisol in feces, for instance? We see from another paper's research that animals, and I couldn't pronounce the name, that's why I didn't say it, a research that animals leave a disturbed area, but this wouldn't be detectable unless there is long-term research of known individuals.
Yeah, it's really important. The paper from right whales with stress in feces from post 9/11 was really, you know, one of the ones that highlighted that. There's been a lot of work from people like Tracy Romano and Nick Keller looking at making those kinds of measurements using other kinds of methods. Nick is working with a behavioral response study we've done on several different dolphin species where we're taking blubber samples during exposure and looking at cortisol in known exposed and known not exposed animals. And we can actually measure that in a relatively short term. It's expressed in a cortisol response over the period of minutes to hours in common dolphins and bottlenose dolphins, for instance. So it is really important, and it's an important reminder that you can have consequences when you don't see any of the things that were on our severity scale. I think there's another paper that I was involved in that Karen Forney was the lead on, called Nowhere to Go, which really focuses on highly resident species. And there was examples from around the world, but for instance, Morro Bay is a place where harbor porpoises have a locally distinct population that just lives there. And if they go somewhere else, they don't do as well. So they don't really have options of leaving. And that you know, avoidance through ramp up, for instance, is something that's been, you know, a mitigation approach. I think Lindsay's correct, you know, that you're not going to be able to quantify those things unless you get someone like Tracy or Nick to make those measurements and make them over a long term. I think where those considerations and or kinds of measurements are maybe particularly important are in context where you have highly resident species in a place where there's some type of localized disturbance. But we're just at the beginning of understanding some of those things. But it is an important reminder to us that, you know, there are responses that we can't see that can still be important.
Thank you. Yeah, there's a lot to follow up on here, but I think we have questions coming in, so I'm just going to rapid fire these at you, Brandon, if you don't mind, just to get through them. Carolyn asks, in the scale of responses affecting survival, the word recruitment is sometimes used. For example, a change in orientation has a score of 1, but recruitment of orienting behavior has a score of 3. What constitutes recruitment? For example, if you observe a change in orientation, when should it have a score of 1 and when should it have a score of 3?
Yeah, it's a good question. And you know, I don't presume to think that our revised severity scale is as much detail as in it and as much discussion as we had is perfect. I think, you know, there's definitely still some interpretation involved. I think the intent there is to really identify scenarios where you have that type of behavior that's kind of increasingly propagated through a population where, and you know, some of those kind of scenarios are difficult to, you know, to discern where you have a response, whether the response is to the event or whether the response is to another animal's response to the event, or whether it's a response to a response that doesn't have anything to do with the event. And you know, we're doing these studies now, these behavioral response studies with social species like common dolphins, where there's group dynamics, and it's like, as many people I know that have observed those species, you get responses to other animals in the group. And the intent there is to try and kind of capture that increasing propagation of an orienting or other type of response through multiple individuals with a group. So anyway, I'm not sure that 100% solves that issue. There's still, some interpretation, I think, of these things as we've gone through, and it's not, it's hard to kind of, capture all possible scenarios. But anyway, that's the intent, is to try to capture the increased severity associated with, the propagation of a response through a population.
Carolyn says, thank you. It's along the same lines as perhaps what she thought. And I'm just going to ask a follow-up question to yourself and to your colleague, Doug Nowacek, who's also joined us here as well.
Oh, great.
I can see that he's also in the chat. So Doug, feel free to come off and into video if you would like. But a question to both of you is, being here and incorporating MMO data, is there anything there that you think could then bolster some of the matrices and some of these responses or these behavioral responses that you're trying to capture? So, and what types of frameworks do you think that might be able to be incorporated?
Yeah, thank you. And Doug, thank you for joining. I'm not sure where you caught on. I know you're teaching some, but I appreciate you jumping on. I did go through this table. I mean, some of my thinking in response to that sort of goes back to, increasing the kind of systematic reporting of some of these things, many of which I know are already, part of protocols that people have to gather some of this information. But, some of these things haven't been as systematically reported in scientific studies or in the context of mitigation as what we've recommended here. And I noted, Doug, that we're probably not going to get all of these from all scenarios. But yeah, that was kind of what I started with and what I would come back to. But any thoughts from your side, Doug? Can you hear us? I don't know, maybe he's replying in the chat.
I was about to say, I can see that he's joined us, but he may not.
Okay.
If he does want to join, if he wants to reply, all he needs to do is come off his mic. Yeah, and interrupt. Yeah. Follow-up question: how might we incorporate behavior states and responses into marine mammal mitigation?
Yeah, it's a good question. I've been I'm currently working with folks in Australia and Germany on some of their behavioral criteria, and trying to kind of take some of these things that don't end in it's 151 instead of 160, right? That's not that. We've now done 2 of these papers that haven't given you a threshold, because there are these contextual variables that we think are important. One of the things that I'm kind of advocating for, and it's hard to do, but would be to maybe, instead of splitting animals into these hearing groups, because that's kind of the weight that sort of comes forward from some of this, right? You've got low frequency animals and you have mid frequency and high frequency animals. But what works for hearing isn't necessarily what's going to work for behavior, right? We've got beaked whales and pilot whales, both in this high frequency hearing group, if you go with our 2019 one. But from a lot of science that's been done, those would fall into really sensitive categories and relatively insensitive categories. Pilot whales can, in many cases, be highly tolerant of noise. So using the hearing things probably doesn't really work. I think what I'm advocating more is that we start to think about behavioral response types, and that actually within animals, there can be behavioral state differences. So the best example would probably be migrating versus feeding baleen whales, where migrating animals, bowheads being the best example that we've got data from a long time on, can be more responsive than feeding animals. And if you think about it from the perspective of motivation, if you're just traveling through an area and there's something, that's present, especially if it's something that's in front of you, you may be more likely to just deviate around it. And then the question is, what is an hour a day deviation in the course of a 3-month migration? What does that mean? Whereas if you're feeding in an area and there's a disturbance there, but there's concentrated food in front of you, you may be less motivated to move around it. So I think, having a context where you've got these response probability species or behavioral state dependent, where you've got response functions that relate to particularly sensitive, typical, particularly tolerant categories, and you could have species that goes into each one of them, and or behavioral states that are associated with those, or that's the way that those kinds of things could be implemented in a practical sense. It's not necessarily easy to do, and it's you're working against some conventions of how these things have typically been applied. But I think the science is pointing us to the fact that there can, for some species, be these large differences. We see 30, 40 decibel differences in response probability for animals that are moving ephemerally or moving around ephemeral prey patches versus those that are feeding at a concentrated, easy to access prey patch. By the way, one thing I didn't say throughout, but I think is just important to note, is these context differences in response shouldn't be a surprise to us. If we were to poll everybody here as to what level of sound bothers you, we might get one answer. But if we asked you what kind of sound bothers you in a library, a restaurant, or an airport, you would have 3 different answers to that question. And that's what we're reflecting, I think, in some of the science.
And then it comes to things like cumulative effects. And so along with your work of building out kind of these behavioral responses, in what context have you also looked at cumulative effects of either constant or of exposure over periods of time, or even other stressors that may influence?
Yeah, great question. And something that many of the early behavioral response studies, including some of the ones I've done, were limited in the time course, where you're looking at a change from something that's minutes long, right? And some there's some activities that occur like that, but for things like seismic surveys, that occur over months, you need to have this this much longer perspective. My colleague Paul Thompson has written a lot of really important papers that look at distributions, seasonally over years, with and without disturbance. So, that's the expansion of some of these experimental studies to longer timescales, and the incorporation of more structured and standardized kinds of ways of observing and quantifying animal behavior over longer periods during uncontrolled activities, like the work that Paul's done, and Enrico Perrotta and Jakob Tuegard and other people that have looked on these longer timescales. It's important. It's hard because it's harder to assign something like the severity, and we get into this in the 2021 paper. There's probably another severity scale that's needed to look on these much longer timelines. We sort of started down that road with some of the whale watch literature, and there's a whole section in the paper that tries to put things on annual and up to decadal scales, but we don't really have enough data across broad species to really understand those. It doesn't mean they're not important, but there's some work. Some of Paul Thompson's work and Jakob's and Enrico Perrotta's have dealt with those topics.
I would say data is one of the most valuable currencies we have right now, especially in marine mammal acoustics. Another question, Emily asked, the matrix you have built on severity of responses is fantastic and so detailed. Do you think it would lend itself quite well, or potentially be easily adapted to score severity of responses to stressors other than noise?
Potentially. I think there's some, that's a really applicable question right now, this matrix that I talked about at the end here, we currently have a project on the West Coast supported by the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management, West Coast of the United States, to look at offshore wind and to apply this kind of risk assessment framework to offshore wind. And, we're talking about mostly floating wind platforms out here that don't have, these massive monopiles that are driven like in Europe and on the East Coast. And so the actual noise associated with, the installation or the operation of them it's present and it's part of the consideration. But now all of a sudden you have floating lines and platforms of things that may aggregate animals. You have potential risks like entanglement or vessels servicing those risks, or servicing those things that have risks like vessel strikes, as well as noise. So we're trying to kind of derive really that vulnerability part of this framework to incorporate these kinds of non-acoustic risks. There's part of that project also deals with sea turtles, and they're particularly concerned about things like magnetic fields and how they may change navigation or impede navigation ability of sea turtles, which is kind of a specialized kind of niche thing, but might be important for that species. So yeah, I think what I like about the way that this is laid out is it includes these kind of population, natural history specific things, but it, rather than kind of looking at the noise, it looks at the intersection of a stressor in space and time and how that overlaps biologically important periods. And that stressor could be acoustic or non-acoustic. So there's still a lot of focus on acoustics, and I keep getting brought into these wind issues especially out here on the West Coast, going, I'm not sure the noise is even necessarily the main part of what we need to be considering in these types of industrial activities that are, have a lot of stuff in the water.
Good point. Yes, especially as the world tries to meet its goals for energy, and we transition into that. We'll have to transition into perhaps how we think of those. I'm going to try and condense a few questions that we have into our final question. And so this is a bit of a three-pronger. So I'll remind you of the questions if you forget kind of the three elements. But how do you think we could use, say, marine mammal or protected species observer data to improve our understanding of behavioral response? And what do you think, or what recommendations would you give somebody that is in the MMO PSO observer industry in regards to increasing their knowledge within this field?
Yeah, I mean, I think I'd probably kind of go back to these kind of recommendations and say, from science and from the observations of real activities and having, trained experts that observe these animals, like as many of these kinds of things that can be documented in a systematic way, and reported and incorporated into, I view it as kind of a self-informing process. And Doug, who's on here, we're trying to sort of steer some of the exposure response ways of making measurements into the installation of offshore wind in some projects off the East Coast, where we're saying, okay, we don't, not everything has to be an experiment, and there's a lot we can learn from observations made in the context of real operations, but they need to be captured in a systematic way, which I know that there are those types of standards, but I think it would just, these types of tables and the kinds of observations that are here, imperfect in some places as they may be, but this level of detail and reported in a quantitative and systematic way is probably the kind of information that we can, hopefully start to increasingly pull from these things, so that those observations aren't just part of an after action report. They can be incorporated into future criteria that, inform the assessment of when and where and how things should happen. I don't know if that answers it, but that's my best shot.
That's great. And what advice would you give of, for observers in the field that are, trying to increase their knowledge in and around this particular space? Obviously, the papers that you've brought up are wonderful reads, and I doubt that if there's anybody on here that hasn't read those already. But is there anything else that perhaps you would point out in a direction to continue your knowledge?
I mean, maybe, and as a question or as just I guess as a suggestion, some of it is, where does all the great information that MMOs are collecting, like, where does it go? And like, how do people use it? How is it affecting the process so that it informs subsequent things? And I know that you all have dealt with that and think about that kind of question. But, when I was at NOAA, I remember, all the lead up to seismic surveys, and all the planning and the mitigation things that were done. And then, there'd be an after action report that kind of came in, and not that many people would really necessarily read it. And then you'd go back 3 years later and you'd be like, we need this, we need that, we need that. And it's like, how does that stuff get incorporated into subsequent decision-making process? And the people that are collecting it maybe should, look and see how that iterative kind of process works, and how the great information that they're collecting can augment scientific, experiments and be, self informing. And the more standardized and detailed it can be, the better. But I guess that would be my, I don't know if it's a charge or a criticism or anything like that, but just maybe ask, how's the information we're collecting being used?
I think that's a great cliffhanger to this, where we'll leave our particular one, because I think that makes for a great other webinar of potentially a panel of how that could be used. And I think that there is a lot of conversation to be had, and I'm sure everybody on the webinar has a lot of questions around that too.
Oh, so one last thing. I forgot to mention Discovery of Sound in the Sea, docits.org. It's a great resource. A lot of people probably know. I see you guys nodding, you might know it, but if you haven't seen that, it's a great place and a good kind of like, you can go from simple to detailed in the complexity around sound. So check out docits.org for more resources too.
Yes, Ashley just popped that in the chat. So I'm going to let her do the thank yous, but just for myself personally, thank you, Brandon. That was wonderful.
Sure. Thanks for inviting me.
Perfect. Thank you very much, everyone. So that's the end of the webinar. I hope you enjoyed it. We are very, very grateful to have had Brandon and really, really interested in a lot of the things that you've raised today. So thank you very much for being here and talking to us. And this is recorded, so we will hopefully have this available soon. But that's it. Thank you very much, everybody, for your input. Some great questions as well in the chat. So yeah, that's pretty much it from us. So thank you very much, everybody. Bye.